the Galactic Federation Academy of Sciences, a beacon of knowledge, a bastion of interstellar cooperation, and apparently a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. Literally. Now gather round, dear audience, as I regale you with the tale of how one human student managed to turn the entire academy on its head, all in the name of science. And by science, I mean blowing stuff up in the most spectacular fashion possible while maintaining a straight face and calling it research. Meet Zach Thompson, your average human teenager with an above-average penchant for pyrotechnics. Zach had always been fascinated by things that go boom, much to the chagrin of his parents, teachers, and the local fire department back on Earth. So when he got the opportunity to study at the prestigious Galactic Federation Academy of Sciences, he saw it as his chance to take his explosive hobby to new interstellar heights. The Academy was a melting pot of species from across the galaxy, each with their own unique abilities, physiologies, and, shall we say, tolerance for danger. There were the Zorblaxians, a species of gelatinous beings who could absorb knowledge through osmosis, about a brain sponge. The Quixlians, insectoid creatures with an uncanny ability to perform complex calculations in their sleep, making them the ultimate sleep learners. And then there were the Fluffians, adorable balls of fur with telekinetic abilities, a tribble with and in Walksack, the lone human in a sea of aliens, grinning from ear to ear like a kid in a candy store, or, more accurately, like a pyromaniac in a fireworks factory. Now you might be wondering, how did a human with a penchant for explosions end up in a galactic science academy? Well, my dear listeners, that's a tale involving a clerical error, a misplaced decimal point, and a very confused admissions officer who thought controlled detonations was a quaint human term for advanced particle physics. But that's a story for another time. As Zach settled into his new academic life, he quickly realized that his alien classmates had a, let's call it a different approach to science. While he was used to the hands-on, trial-and-error emphasis on the error method of Earth scientists, his new peers preferred a more theoretical approach. Take, for instance, the Zorblaxians. Their idea of a chemistry experiment was to absorb the contents of a textbook and then regurgitate it in a slimy, gelatinous puddle. Effective, perhaps. Messy. Absolutely. Boring? You bet your sweet bippy it was. The Quixlians, on the other antenna, conducted their experiments in their dreams. They'd go to sleep, their compound eyes twitching rapidly as they solved complex equations in their slumber, and wake up with the answers scribbled on their exoskeletons in some sort of bioluminescent ink. Talk about beauty sleep? And the Fluffians? Well, they just floated things around with their minds, arranging atoms and molecules into perfect structures without so much as lifting a furry finger. It was like watching a very small, very cute god play with the building blocks of the universe. Zach, however, had other ideas. His first-class project was titled An Investigation into the Propulsive Properties of Various Chemical Compounds in a Vacuum Environment. A mouthful, to be sure, but it sounded scientific enough to pass muster with the alien fact. Little did they know that this innocuous-sounding project was, in fact, Zach's elaborate plan to create the galaxy's biggest firecracker. The day of the project presentations arrived, and the lecture hall was abuzz with excitement. Well, as much excitement as you can expect from a bunch of aliens discussing quantum mechanics and the mating habits of subatomic particles. The Zorblaxian presenter oozed onto the stage, quite literally, and began to vibrate at various frequencies, transmitting knowledge directly into the brains of the audience. Half the class fell asleep, while the other half looked like they were having seizures. Science? Next up was a Quixlian, who simply fell asleep on stage. The audience watched in rapt attention as equations and formulae began to appear on the Quixlian's exoskeleton, glowing softly in the dimmed light of the lecture hall. It was like watching paint dry. If the paint was bioluminescent and could solve differential equations, the Fluffian's presentation was a telekinetic tour de force, with atoms and molecules dancing in the air like a subatomic ballet. It was beautiful, graceful, and about as exciting as watching grass grow in slow motion. And then it was Zach's turn. He strode onto the stage, pulling behind him a large, mysterious contraption covered in a sheet. The alien students leaned forward in their seats or whatever passed for seats in their various physiologies, curious about what this strange human was up to. Esteemed faculty, honored classmates, Zach began, his voice dripping with faux formality. I present to you the culmination of my research, the Interstellar Propulsion Enhancement Device, or IPAB for short. He dramatically whipped off the sheet, revealing a contraption that looked like it had been cobbled together from spare parts found in a junkyard. Which, to be fair, Zack had spent weeks scrounging through the Academy's waste disposal units, much to the confusion of the maintenance droids. The device was a hodgepodge of tubes, wires, and what appeared to be a repurposed food replicator. At its center was a large, clear chamber filled with a bubbling, ominous-looking liquid. Now, I know what you're thinking, Zack continued, barely containing his glee. This looks like a bunch of junk held together with space tape and hope. And you'd be right. But it's also a revolutionary propulsion system that could change interstellar travel as we know it. The alien students exchanged confused glances. This wasn't like any propulsion system they'd ever seen. Where were the antimatter containment fields, the quantum flux capacitors, the tachyon emitters? Allow me to demonstrate, Zack said, reaching for a comically large red button on the side of the machine. It was at this point that Professor Zixnax, a tentacled being of indeterminate gender and infinite patience, finally spoke up. Mr. Thompson, they gurgled, perhaps it would be wise to first explain the theoretical principles behind your device. Zack's grin widened. Of course, Professor. You see, the IPED works on a simple principle. Boom makes things go fast. There was a moment of stunned silence, broken only by the ominous bubbling of the liquid in the chamber. I see, Professor Zixnax said, clearly not seeing at all. And how exactly does this boom propel a spacecraft? Well, Zack replied, his finger hovering dangerously close to the big red button. That's what we're about to find out. Before anyone could stop him, Zack slammed his hand down on the button. For a brief, terrifying moment, nothing happened. The alien students began to relax, thinking perhaps this was just some strange human joke they didn't understand. And then, with a sound that can only be described as foomfif, the device exploded. Now, when I say exploded, I don't mean it disintegrated into a million pieces, raining destruction upon the hapless alien audience. No, this was a controlled explosion, directed upwards through a series of tubes and chambers in the device. The result was a spectacular jet of multicolored flame that shot up to the ceiling of the lecture hall, leaving a scorch mark in the shape of what looked suspiciously like a smiley face. The alien students reacted in various ways, all of them hilarious. The Zorblaxians liquefied in shock, turning into quivering puddles of goo. The Quixlians' exoskeletons rattled so hard it sounded like a xylophone concert. And the Fluffians? They puffed up to twice their size, looking like angry telekinetic dandelions. As for Zack, he stood there, his lab coat singed and his eyebrows slightly smoking, with the biggest grin you've ever seen plastered across his face. Ta-da! He exclaimed, throwing his arms wide. Interstellar propulsion enhancement device. Professor Zixnax, who had taken cover behind their podium, slowly raised a tentacle. Mr. Thompson, they said, their voice a mixture of fear and fascination. Would you care to explain what just happened? Zack, still grinning like a maniac, launched into his explanation. Well, you see, Professor, I've been studying the propulsion systems of various spacecraft, and I noticed something interesting. They all rely on the same basic principling, pushing matter in one direction to move in the opposite direction. But they're also, he gestured to the still-smoking device. So I thought, why not make it more exciting? Instead of a steady, controlled burn, why not create a series of rapid, high-energy explosions? It's like turning a spacecraft into one big internal combustion engine. The alien students, who had begun to recover from their shock, leaned in closer, suddenly intrigued. This was unlike anything they'd ever encountered in their textbooks or dream calculations. But that's so inefficient, sputtered a Quixlian student, his antennae twitching in agitation. The energy waste alone would... Astronomical? Zack finished for him. Maybe. But think about the acceleration. With a series of controlled detonations, we could achieve thrust levels that would make your head spin. Literally, in some cases, he added, nodding towards a Zorblaxian who was still slowly reforming from its puddle state. Professor Zixnax, who had cautiously emerged from behind the podium, waved a tentacle for attention. While your enthusiasm is commendable, Mr. Thompson, I fail to see how this relates to actual spacecraft propulsion. Surely you don't propose we fill our ships with explosive materials? Zack's grin, if possible, grew even wider. That's the beauty of it, Professor. We don't need to. Space itself is full of fuel if you know where to look. He pressed another button on his device, and a holographic display flickered to life, showing a map of a solar system. Imagine a ship equipped with powerful electromagnetic fields. As it travels, it could gather hydrogen from the interstellar medium. Not much, mind you, but enough. The display zoomed in, showing a simulated spacecraft scooping up tiny dots representing hydrogen atoms. Then Zack continued, his eyes gleaming with excitement. We superheat and compress this hydrogen in containment chambers. When we have enough, boom. He clapped his hands together, causing several Fluffians to levitate in surprise. We detonated in a controlled explosion, channeling the energy for propulsion. The holographic ship on the display suddenly lurched forward, leaving a trail of cartoon-like explosion symbols behind it. It's like turning the entire universe into one big fuel tank, Zack concluded, looking immensely pleased with himself. The lecture hall erupted into a cacophony of excited chittering, gurgling, and telepathic exclamations. The alien students, initially skeptical, were now abuzz with the possibilities. A Zorblaxian student raised a pseudopod. But what about the structural integrity of this spacecraft? Surely, repeated explosions would. Excellent question, Zack interrupted, practically bouncing with enthusiasm. That's where the real innovation comes in. We'd need to develop new materials, of course. Something flexible yet incredibly strong. I'm thinking a carbon nanotube we've infused with. Well, I don't want to give away all my secrets, he said with a wink. Professor Zixnax, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. Mr. Thompson, while your idea is unconventional, to say the least, I must admit it has a certain human charm to it. They paused, their tentacles twisting in what might have been the alien equivalent of a thoughtful stroke of the chin. However, I'm concerned about the safety implications. Controlled explosions in space seem rather risky. Zack's grin took on a slightly manic edge. Ah, but Professor, isn't that what science is all about? Pushing boundaries? Taking risks? Besides, he added, his voice dropping to a stage whisper, between you and me, humans have been using controlled explosions to get around for centuries. We call them internal combustion engines. This is just that idea taken to its logical, somewhat insane conclusion. The alien students gasped in a mixture of shock and awe. The idea that humans had been casually harnessing explosions for everyday transportation was both terrifying and oddly impressive. A Fluffian student, its fur still slightly puffed from the earlier shock, raised a tiny paw. But what about the noise? The vibrations? Wouldn't it be incredibly uncomfortable for the crew? Zack's eyes lit up. Ah, now we're getting to the fun part. Imagine this. Instead of trying to dampen the vibrations, we use them. We could set up resonance chambers throughout the ship, tuning them to the frequency of the explosions. With the right setup, we could turn the entire spacecraft into one giant musical instrument. He pressed another button on his device, and suddenly the lecture hall was filled with a deep, rhythmic thrumming. It started slow and low, then began to pick up tempo and pitch. Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted non-binary alien life forms, Zack announced over the growing beat, I give you space dubstep. The thrumming reached a crescendo, and then, with a sound that can only be described as whoop 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 whoop, it dropped into a full-on electronic beat. The floor of the lecture hall began to vibrate in time with the music. The reaction from the alien students was a sight to behold. The Zorblaxians began to undulate in rhythm, their gelatinous bodies becoming impromptu lava lamps. The Kixlians' antennae started twitching in perfect time, looking like tiny conductors leading an invisible orchestra. And the Fluffians, they started to bounce up and down, their telekinetic abilities kicking in and causing various small objects around the room to dance in midair. Even Professor Zixnax couldn't resist, their tentacles swaying to the beat. This is most unusual, Mr. Thompson, they said, failing to maintain their professorial composure. But I fail to see how this relates to spacecraft propulsion. Zack, who was now full-on dancing to his space dubstep, shouted over the music. It's all about morale, Professor. Long space voyages can be boring and monotonous, but imagine if your entire ship was one big dance party. Crew productivity would skyrocket. He executed a perfect moonwalk across the stage, which was all the more impressive considering the stage was vibrating like a giant subwoofer. Plus, he added with a mischievous wink, it would make first contact with alien civilizations way more fun. Nothing says, we come in peace like a sick beat. As if to emphasize his point, the music shifted, incorporating what sounded like alien whale songs and the beeping of distant pulses into its rhythm. The result was a mind-bending mix of Earth, electronica, and cosmic symphony. The alien students were fully into it now. A group of Zorblaxians had merged into one giant, pulsating dance blob. The Quixlians were breakdancing, their exoskeletons clicking and clacking in time with the beat, and the Fluffians had formed a conga line, floating through the air in a furry, telekinetic conga line. Professor Zixnax, still trying to maintain some semblance of order, raised all their tentacles. While this is undeniably entertaining, Mr. Thompson, I must insist we return to the scientific principles behind your proposal. Zack, still grooving to the beat, nodded. Of course, Professor. Let's break it down. Not the beat, I mean. Although that drop is coming up and it's gonna be sick. I mean the science. He moonwalked back to his device and pressed a series of buttons. The holographic display changed, showing a cutaway view of a theoretical spacecraft. So, here's the deal, Zack began, his words somehow fitting perfectly into the rhythm of the music. So here's the deal, Zack began, his words somehow fitting perfectly into the rhythm of the music. We start with a basic spacecraft design, but we hollow out large sections and replace them with our explosion chambers. The hologram zoomed in on several spherical chambers distributed throughout the ship. These chambers, Zack continued, tapping his foot to the beat, are lined with a special alloy I've been working on. It's a mixture of titanium, carbon nanotubes, and a dash of unobtainium. You know, for flavor. A Kixlian student raised a trembling antenna. Unobtainium? Is that a real element? Zack winked. It is if you believe hard enough. And in space, belief is half the battle. He paused, considering. The other half is not exploding when you don't mean to, but we'll get to that. The hologram zoomed in further, showing the interior of one of the chambers. Now here's where the magic happens. We inject a mixture of hydrogen and oxygen into the chamber. Then, we use a series of high-energy lasers to compress and heat the mixture until, on cue, the holographic chamber lit up with a miniature explosion. Several Fluffians instinctively ducked, their fur standing on end. The explosion is directed through these nozzles, Zack explained, pointing to a series of openings at the back of the chamber. And here's the clever bit. We time the explosions in each chamber to create a continuous thrust. It's like a fiery, explosive game of patty cake, with each chamber taking turns to go boom. The hologram began to animate, showing a cascade of explosions rippling through the ship's chambers in a mesmerizing pattern. It was like watching a fireworks display in slow motion, if the fireworks were inside a spaceship and actually propelling it forward. Professor Zixnax, who had given up trying to look disapproving and was now swaying gently to the beat, raised a tentacle. But Mr. Thompson, the energy requirements for such a sim would be astronomical. Zack's grin widened. Ah, but that's the beauty of it, Prof. We're in space. You know what space has a lot of? The alien students looked at each other in confusion. A brave Zorblaxian ventured. Space? Exactly, Zack exclaimed. And what's in that space? Hydrogen, the most abundant element in the universe. We simply scoop it up as we go. It's like a cosmic road trip where you never have to stop for gas because the road is made of gas. He pressed another button, and the hologram zoomed out to show the ship traveling through space, a faint blue glow surrounding its front end. This electromagnetic field acts like a giant butterfly net for hydrogen atoms, Zack explained. We scoop him up, store him, and when we need a boost, we mix him with some oxygen we brought along, and boom, instant rocket fuel. It's a Fluffian student. Its fur now styled into a spectacular afro, thanks to all the static electricity in the air, raised a tiny paw. But what about the crew? Wouldn't all these explosions be, well, terrifying? Zack's eyes twinkled with mischief. Oh, now that's where the real fun begins. You see, we don't fight the vibrations. We embrace them. He pressed yet another button. Seriously, how many buttons did this contraption have? And the hologram changed to show the interior of the ship. The walls were lined with what looked like giant, futuristic speakers. We channel the vibrations from the explosions through the ship's structure, Zack explained, practically bouncing with excitement. With the right tuning, we can turn the entire ship into one massive musical instrument. The explosions become the beat, the ship's hull becomes the melody, and the crew, they become the dancers. To demonstrate, Zack cranked up the volume on his space dubstep. The entire lecture hall began to vibrate in harmony with the beat, creating a fully immersive, multi-sensory experience. Imagine, Zack shouted over the music, crossing the galaxy in a ship that's part rocket, part rave. You're not just traveling through space, you're parting through it. The alien students, who had long since abandoned any pretense of academic decorum, were now fully caught up in the infectious rhythm. Zoblaxians were shape-shifting in time with the beat, forming living, pulsating fractals. Fixians were using their incredible calculation abilities to predict the next drop and synchronize their movements perfectly. And the Fluffians? They had formed a telekinetic dance circle, levitating each other in increasingly complex patterns. Even Professor Zixnax, despite their best efforts to maintain a shred of professorial dignity, was getting into it. Their tentacles were moving in ways that would make an octopus breakdancer jealous. But wait, Zack said, somehow managing to make his voice heard over the music without shouting. There's more. This isn't just about having the galaxy's biggest party on our hands. It's about science. He pressed a button seriously. Where did all these buttons come from? And the hologram changed again. This time, it showed a complex series of equations and diagrams. You see, Zack explained, his words still somehow fitting perfectly into the rhythm. By carefully controlling the timing and intensity of our explosions, we can create complex wave patterns in the ship's structure. With the right tuning, we can use these waves for all sorts of sciencey goodness. The hologram zoomed in on different parts of the ship, highlighting various systems as Zack continued his explanation. I need to scan for dark matter. Just adjust the beat to create the right resonance frequency. Want to communicate with a distant planet? Crank up the bass and use the ship as a giant subwoofer. Alien invasion. Just drop the sickest beat the universe has ever heard and watch them dance their way back to their home planet. The alien students were hanging on his every word, their eyes or various sensory organs wide with a mixture of awe, confusion, and what might have been the early stages of tinnitus. But the real breakthrough, Zack said, his voice taking on a tone of reverence, is in the field of xenobiology. He pressed another button. At this point, it was clear that his device was more button than machine, and the hologram changed to show a DNA double helix pulsating in time with the music. By fine-tuning our space dubstep, we can resonate with the very building blocks of life itself. Imagine being able to communicate with alien microbes through the power of sick beats. We could revolutionize medicine, terraform planets, maybe even create entirely new forms of life. A Zorblaxian student, who had taken on the shape of a giant question mark, burbled inquiringly. But how is this different from regular genetic engineering? Zack's grin threatened to split his face in two. Because, my gelatinous friend, regular genetic engineering is boring. This is genetic engineering with style. Why carefully snip and splice genes when you can make them dance to your tune? Literally. To demonstrate, he adjusted a dial on his device. The DNA in the hologram began to writhe and twist, restructuring itself in time with the music. It was like watching the world's smallest, most complex dance party. Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted non-binary alien lifeforms, Zack announced, his voice taking on the tone of a carnival barker. I give you the future of science. A future where we don't just study the universe, we make it dance to our tune. As if on cue, the music reached a crescendo. The bass dropped so hard it felt like the entire academy might shake itself apart. The alien students, caught up in the moment, let out a cheer that threatened to drown out even the music. Zorblaxians exploded into showers of glittering droplets, only to reform in complex, fractal patterns. Kixians vibrated so fast they briefly phased out of normal space-time, their antennae leaving trails of quantum probability in the air. And the Fluffians? They puffed up to the point where they resembled nothing so much as a field of dandelions caught in a telekinetic hurricane. As for Professor Zixnax, they had finally given up all pretense of maintaining order. Their tentacles were a blur of motion, executing dance moves that defied the laws of physics and good taste in equal measure. And in the center of it all stood Zack, arms raised triumphantly, his lab coat singed and smoking, a manic grin plastered across his face. He was the eye of the storm, the calm center of the chaos he had unleashed. As the music finally began to fade, the alien students slowly came back to their senses. They looked around in confusion, as if waking from a shared dream, or perhaps a shared hallucination. Professor Zixnax, their tentacles still twitching slightly to the lingering beat, cleared their throat a whatever passed for a throat in their species. Mr. Thompson, they said, their voice a mixture of awe, fear, and what might have been the first stirrings of a migraine. That was certainly something. Zack, still grinning, gave a theatrical bow. Thank you, Professor. I call it the Thompson theory of rhythmic astrophysics. Or you know, how I learned to stop worrying and love the boom. The professor's tentacles twisted in what might have been the alien equivalent of a raised eyebrow. And what exactly do you propose we do with this? Zack's grin, if possible, grew even wider. Why change the universe, of course? Think about it. We could revolutionize space travel, turning every journey into a non-stop party. We could communicate with alien life forms through the universal language of sick beats. We could literally make stars dance. He paused for dramatic effect, looking out over the sea of stunned alien faces. But more importantly, we could finally answer that age-old question that has puzzled philosophers and scientists for millennia. Can the universe drop a beat so funky that even it can't dance to it? There was a moment of stunned silence. Then, slowly, a ripple of laughter began to spread through the lecture hall. It started with a few nervous chuckles from the quicklings, grew as the Zorblaxians joined in with their burbling giggles, and reached a crescendo as the Fluffians added their high-pitched titters to the mix. Even Professor Zyxnax, despite their best efforts to maintain some semblance of academic decorum, found their tentacles quivering with suppressed mirth. "Mr. Thompson," they said, their voice wavering between amusement and exasperation, I must say. "In all my cycles of teaching, I have never encountered a project quite like this." Zack's grin took on a hopeful edge. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing, Prof?" The professor's tentacles twisted in what might have been a shrug. "I'm not entirely sure. On one hand, your project violates at least 17 different safety protocols, not to mention the laws of physics as we understand them. On the other hand," they paused, their eye stalks swiveling to take in the still giggling alien students. "I haven't seen the class this engaged since we discovered that quantum mechanics was actually an elaborate practical joke played on the universe by a pan-dimensional being with too much time on its hands." Zack's eyebrows shot up. "Wait, what? Quantum mechanics is a joke. But then how do we explain that?" Professor Zyxnax interrupted. "Is a discussion for another time, preferably after I've had several strong drinks and a long conversation with my therapist." They turned back to address the class. "As for Mr. Thompson's project, while it is unconventional, to say the least, it does demonstrate a certain creative approach to problem solving that is, dare I say it, refreshingly human." The alien students murmured in agreement, many of them still swaying slightly to the lingering echoes of the space dubstep. Therefore, the professor continued, their tentacles forming what might have been a resigned shrug. "I have no choice but to give this project a passing grade. May the universe have mercy on us all." The lecture hall erupted in cheers. Zorblaxians oozed excitedly, Quixlians chittered in approval, and Fluffians levitated in joy. As for Zack, he took another theatrical bow, his grin threatening to split his face in two. Thank you, he said, waving to his alien classmates. "I'd like to thank the Academy, my parents for never questioning why their garage kept exploding, and of course Sir Isaac Newton for giving us laws of physics that are just begging to be broken, or at least bent into funny shapes and made to dance." As the excitement began to die down and the alien students started to file out of the lecture hall, still chattering excitedly about explosive propulsion and intergalactic dance parties, Professor Zyxnax approached Zack. "Mr. Thompson," they said, their tone serious despite the lingering twitch in their tentacles, "while your project was undeniably innovative, I feel I must warn you. The galaxy can be a dangerous place, especially for those who challenge the status quo." Zack's grin softened into a more serious expression. "I understand, Professor, but isn't that what science is all about? Challenging what we think we know, pushing boundaries, boldly going where no one has gone before." The professor's eye stalks swiveled in what might have been a nod. "Indeed, just perhaps try to do it with fewer explosions in the future. Our insurance premiums are high enough as it is." Zack laughed. "No promises, Prof, but I'll try to keep the collateral damage to a minimum." As he gathered up his things, preparing to leave the lecture hall, Zack paused. "You know, Professor, I've been thinking, if we can use controlled explosions for propulsion, and we can use those same explosions to create music, who's to say we can't use music to create explosions?" Professor Zyxnax's tentacles went rigid. "Mr. Thompson, I must insist that you do not pursue that line of inquiry. The last thing this galaxy needs is weaponized dubstep." Zack's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Of course, Professor. I would never dream of creating a bass drop so devastating it could shatter planets. That would be irresponsible." He paused, then added with a wink, "But hypothetically speaking, If one were to create such a thing, what would you call it? The Death Star? No, too on the nose. The Bars Cannon? The Wub-Wub of Doom? The professor's eye stalks drooped in what was unmistakably a sign of resignation. Mr. Thompson, I believe I speak for the entire faculty when I say, please, for the love of all that is holy in this universe, stick to your exploding spaceships. Zack grinned and gave a mock salute. You got it, prof. Exploding spaceships it is. But you have to admit, a Bars Cannon would be pretty cool. As he sauntered out of the lecture hall, leaving behind a very bemused Professor Zixnax, Zack couldn't help but hum a little tune to himself. It sounded suspiciously like the opening bars of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, but with a distinctly electronic. So Galaxy Zack decided, I'd better watch out, because if there was one thing humans were good at, it was taking a perfectly reasonable scientific principle and turning it into something that went boom in the most spectacular way possible. And who knew? Maybe someday, in the far future, alien civilizations would look up at the stars and wonder at the strange, rhythmic pulsing coming from that obscure arm of the galaxy. They might even give it a name. The Milky Way? No, too dairy. The Rhythm Nebula? Getting warmer? The Great Galactic Rave? Now we're talking. But for now, Zack had more immediate concerns, like figuring out how to turn his dorm room into a zero-gravity dance floor without getting evicted. Again, after all, science waits for no one, especially when that science involves explosions, sick beats, and the possibility of accidentally creating a black hole on the dance floor. But that, as they say, is a story for another time.